Top European Union officials are in China, marking 50 years of diplomatic ties, as trade tensions between the two sides are growing. Despite the smiles, EU chief Ursula von der Leyen told Chinese President Xi Jinping that they had reached an inflection point. She called for a rebalancing of Europe's historic trade deficit with China. There was some agreement, though, on how Brussels and Beijing can both act to tackle climate change. Let's bring in Alicja, Bachulska, a policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations in Warsaw. Now, 50 years of ties between the EU and China. Overall, has the relationship improved over the years?
Well, in retrospect, it depends through what lens we're looking at the development of ties between the EU and China. If we're looking at it purely through the lens of economic cooperation and trade growth, there has been a period in which China-EU relations were really kind of a growth model for many entities around the world, with multiple European countries and companies benefiting tremendously from the way China has become a global actor. But times have changed. And at the moment, we're probably at a historic low when it comes to the overall shape and atmosphere surrounding EU-China relations, both in Beijing and in Brussels.
Now, what's the EU's problem here? Are there just too many different member states with different priorities for China to take it seriously?
I think that if you look at the communication coming from Brussels, especially from Ursula von der Leyen, it's very clear that there has been a rethink of strategic challenges that are tied to China's industrial and security policy, and how these two types of policies and China's mindset in engaging with, for example, Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine have impacted the perception of China in Europe. So now we are definitely moving away from this cooperation paradigm, and China is increasingly seen in many European capitals as an actor with both the ambitions and the capacity to actually have a very negative impact on European security and competitiveness. The whole debate about overcapacity, how China's industrial policy is impacting negatively European competitiveness. This is just a tip of the iceberg in which China is seen now as a very big challenge to Europeans.
Now, let's have a look at another stumbling block. Beijing has so far ignored European pleas to stop supporting Russia in its war in Ukraine. The EU, for its part, slapped sanctions on 2 Chinese banks. What more can the EU do to reduce China's support for Russia?
Well, frankly, the EU has to be very consistent in signaling that China-Russia relations are becoming a very serious, maybe not at this stage existential threat, but at least that the EU is taking this relationship very seriously, and that across different European capitals, decision makers are now seeing China-Russia cooperation as much more than only a marriage of convenience. But I'm afraid that at the same time, despite the fact that there is this growing awareness of how closely intertwined China and Russia are in terms of their strategic goals, there is a limited level of political ambition to seriously tackle this problem. And I guess that, this is a question of the fact that Europeans have so many problems on their plates at the moment that it seems easier to brush off China as this much more distant threat, despite the fact that China and Russia relations are very important and having a tangible impact on the situation on the ground in Ukraine and in turn also on European security.
And earlier, our Teipei correspondent Yuchen told us what China hopes to achieve at the summit.
So if we look at China's leader Xi Jinping's speech, you can see a lot of times he has mentioned win-win situation. So basically, Beijing is trying to present itself as a more reliable global trade partner compared with the United States. And he wants Brussels to join the effort to confront what it describes as a bullying measure from the United States. And all these methods have one purpose, that is to keep the to keep the European market open. So, but when it comes to trade imbalance, Beijing is unlikely to make any concrete compromise and to really tackle the problem of overcapacity. And it doesn't really think state subsidy is a problem, as EU has repeatedly raised and addressed to China. So basically, they want the European market to be open, but they don't want to make any big compromises. And one of the best tools they're going to use to kind of pressure the EU to make concessions first is to through the dominance on rare earths. So basically, they want to use this leverage to see if the EU would like make concession first or soften its tone on China's position on Ukraine.
Okay, and I'd like to discuss also another factor here because, you know, a lot of eyes right now are on Trump's tariff policy, which is impacting both Europe and China. How is China hoping to exploit the difficult trade relationship between the EU and the US in this summit?
Well, apparently, Beijing knows this is a high-stakes meeting for the European Union, and it sees the U.S. tariff policy as a disruptive factor, but on the other hand, he also sees this tense transatlantic relation as a great opportunity to kind of woo the European Union to its side. So basically, Beijing entered this meeting, this summit, with an emboldened attitude. They decided to, you know, stand their ground. They're not going to make compromises. And why is that? Because that's what China did with the U.S. You know, like they went tit for tat with the U.S. when Donald Trump has imposed a lot of tariffs on Chinese goods, and they see it as a success to, you know, stand their ground when it comes to the U.S. So they would use this same playbook because they think it works, and they would use it and apply it when they trying to make a deal with the European Union.
And that's Yuchen Li joining us from Taipei. Thanks for your reporting. And joining us now is Anchal Vohra with the view, the European view from Brussels. What are the EU leaders' expectations at this summit?
Well, they're definitely not expecting China to stop supporting Chinese companies, which essentially allows Chinese companies to overproduce at lower prices. And that is a long-term threat to European manufacturers because then these Chinese companies flood European market with these products. However, at the summit today, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen did expect China to open up its markets to European manufacturers. If you cannot stop providing subsidies to Chinese companies, her message seems to be allow European companies a bigger access in European markets. According to a recent report of a major think tank based here in Brussels, EU companies in China are not having a good time. They don't see their businesses being profitable. They want more market access that they're not getting. But the Chinese to that say the Chinese companies are more competitive. Drop your prices, be more competitive. You want to sell more here. So the idea for the EU Commission President there and the Council President there is to try and convince the Chinese administration to give the European companies more access if they also want to continue to sell products here. And it remains to be seen whether there's going to be some sort of a compromise there. The other important thing that's going to be discussed in the summit from the European perspective is access to rare earth minerals. Now, the EU depends on China for 98% of the rare earth minerals that it needs, primarily for its defense industries, not just for other various industries as well. And there seemed to be some room, at least initially, because the Chinese seem to be hinting that the restrictions they'd imposed on the export of rare earth minerals was intended for leverage for its own talks with the US and not essentially against the EU. But the Europeans here seem to believe that that is essentially a response to Europe imposing sanctions on some exports by China to Russia, which are dual use, which means for civilian and military purposes. So it remains to be seen if those restrictions are going to be lifted by China or not.
What are the prospects for the EU improving relations with China? What could they cooperate on?
Well, they can cooperate on climate change, and both sides do seem determined on that question. And considering that China is talking a lot about how the Chinese and the Europeans are holding free trade world order and multilateralism, and they're doing that in opposition to the US to try and tell the EU that that's where that the two blocs here, the EU and China, should cooperate against Washington. It seems that the European side is keener to cooperate on climate change since Donald Trump has walked out of the Paris Agreement. So let's see for the summit conclusions. Let's see if something emerges on that front.
Anchal, Vohra in Brussels, thank you. China is the EU's second largest trading partner, but in recent months, that side of their relationship has been far from easy.
Since October of last year, Chinese electric cars imported into the European Union have been hit with tariffs, anywhere from 27 to 45%. Beijing opposes the levies and the fact that Chinese companies face restrictions when participating in EU energy initiatives. Meanwhile, Europe is dealing with its own trade challenges, like restrictions on exporting rare earths from China. In general, EU firms feel the playing field is unfair. 2 Chinese banks were recently hit with EU sanctions for allegedly cooperating with Russia. Apparently, the EU wanted to send a clear message that they're serious about concerns over China's support for Russia, whether direct or indirect. They've made their stance known. Now it'll be interesting to see how China responds to this. The biggest concern from Europe's perspective is trade balance. While China continues to expand its exports, European exports to China are stagnating. The result? Europe's trade deficit with China is growing. Europe saw China opening its borders further, offering opportunities to invest and sell. What many didn't anticipate or weren't fully prepared for was that China would leverage its accession to the WTO in 2001 to gain access to other markets, and at the same time work hard to become more competitive. This is especially true for the automotive and pharmaceutical industries, 2 important sectors for the European economy. Chinese companies are no longer allowed to participate in large tenders for medical supplies, and EU firms face similar restrictions in China. Trust is currently missing between the 2 sides. That's a fundamental issue that can only be rebuilt through negotiations and must lead to concrete action. The deeply intertwined economic relationship between Europe and China makes outright escalation tricky, and not without consequence for both powers. But easing tensions is complicated. China is both a competitor to Europe and a strategic rival.